Mayor, we appreciate it. Good to see you. And really, this is all about a preview for the Ed Burke trial. That and our audience Sunday night, these are is Sunday Night Football. So we're thinking, okay, these are some people that might not, even though we all know who Ed Burke is, some might not get the significance of this trial. What would you say to the couch potato at home going, why should we care about how this goes?
I think this is probably one of the most significant public corruption trials of a generation. Ed Burke is somebody who was on the lips of so many generations of FBI agents and former AUSAs, and the fact that he's been charged and now is going to trial is a very significant development, not only in the history of public corruption cases, but frankly in the history of the city. Now I should hasten to add, he's entitled to a presumption of innocence, and the burden of proof lies entirely on the part of the prosecutors. But I think they have a very strong case based upon what I've seen in the superseding indictment, as well as watching the back and forth with the pretrial motions that have been flying fast and furious over these last couple weeks.
And the Danny Solis tapes.
Yes. It'll be interesting to see how the prosecution decides to get them in, since they've made it very clear that they're not going to put Solis on the witness stand. If they can get away with that, that's probably a good thing. The defense has threatened to call him as a witness. But stepping back, Ed Burke is a guy who spent really his entire adult life as an alderman. And really early on in his tenure as an alderman, he became extraordinarily powerful. Not only when he was battling and fighting Harold Washington during council wars, and we should not forget that version of Ed Burke because it's still there, but over time, as chairman of the Finance Committee, not only did he wield significant power, having unchecked ability to do what he wanted with a $100 million a year workers' compensation program, unheard of for a legislative leader when normally workers' comp and other things related to employment are the sole domain of the executive branch. But he had a car, he had a driver. He had a position of great authority and power within the Cook County Democratic Party. He was the gatekeeper for generations of people who aspired to be judges at the county level and going upwards for there. This is a man who understood how to maximize power and how to get what he wanted.
Gatekeeper, what did that mean? If you wanted to be a judge in Cook County, you had to see Ed Burke.
You had to absolutely kiss the ring of Ed Burke, and you had to have powerful sponsors if he wasn't your sponsor, but you weren't getting over the threshold unless he said yes.
As a former federal prosecutor, you know what it takes to first even get an indictment and then get a conviction. How important are those tapes?
I think the tapes are critically important in this case in particular because if you read the language that's extracted from the tapes in the superseding indictment, almost all the charges are based upon his own words. So it's, as we used to say back in the day, it's almost impossible to cross-examine tapes. So having his words being played before the jury, hearing his voice, the way in which he operated, the crudeness of the demands that he was making to get business for his private law firm, that's going to be very, very powerful evidence for the prosecution. Now, to be clear, the defense attorneys are not any slouches. You've got 3 different sets of lawyers, all of them the same generation of former assistant U.S. attorneys who've had very strong careers in the private sector being criminal defense attorneys. So it is going to be a battle, and it already has been. I would also add the judge is a very experienced trial lawyer. She was a contemporary of mine in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and some notable accomplishments during her tenure there. Plus, she's presided over some pretty significant cases as a judge, very experienced. So it's going to be an interesting 3-legged match, if you will, as this case goes to trial next week.
Would you say that your victory was tied to his indictment?
There's no question whatsoever. I think a couple things. One, it was shocking when word came that the FBI was raiding his city hall offices and his ward office. That was, I think, the news cycle for 3 or 4 days just over that. And then when the indictment came down and you started to read the case that the judge had put together, or that the U.S. Attorney's Office had put together. But for me, I think what made a difference is the so-called frontrunners in the race at that time all had a connection to Burke, all didn't want to talk about that connection. But I think that at that moment, the tide turned. Chicago has been a town dominated by machine politics, and Ed Burke played that game with the best of them. But I think people were just sick and tired of the corruption and were open to the opportunity that I think my candidacy presented at that time. So there's no question that it definitely played a big and I think deciding role in my first run for office.
And then as mayor, how did you see you did, of course, take down some of his power. Mm-hmm. He was no longer the finance chair. But still, what was it like to see that he still wielded some power for a moment or two at the beginning of your tenure?
Well, you think about the fact that when the FBI raided his offices, a lot of people would have said, I got to stay as far away as possible. But remember, within a couple weeks' time, he had his big annual fundraiser, and hundreds still came. That tells you a lot about the power that he wielded for so long. People, I think, truly valued and respected him. But I also think people were afraid not to be there. He was also known as a guy who took names. And when you didn't do what he wanted to do, he wasn't quiet about it. So he had a reputation as somebody who could retaliate and really cause people's lives to be difficult if they didn't bend to his will. So he's an interesting character study for sure. Not a favorite of mine. I will always remember him as a guy who stood in the way and did everything he could to really thwart the ability of Harold Washington during his first term to try to get any of the major things accomplished. He wasn't as direct with me after that first city council meeting, but there's no question he was lurking in the not in the shadows. He was there. You could tell that he was behind the scenes, whispering in people's ear and encouraging opposition.
Is the machine dead?
I think the machine in its infrastructure is dead. But I think what's not dead is the muscle memory that was built into city government, city players over so many decades. If, for example, there's an allegation in the superseding indictment against Burke that a building inspector got whistled to his ward office, spent about 5 minutes there, and then went and wrote up a bunch of bogus tickets to shut down the rehabbing of that Burger King drive-through. Why does that happen? That happens because that person puts their allegiance to a powerful alderman over their responsibilities as a city employee. So to say that the machine is dead in all of its vestiges, I don't think is accurate because that muscle memory, unfortunately, is still baked into the hearts and mind of too many people in the city.
How about as a preview to the Madigan? I mean, how closely is Madigan going to be watching what goes on here?
Well, Madigan's lawyers, I'm sure, have been following all the back and forth with great interest. This is a big test for the prosecution and the strength of their ability to bring home such a big target. I think failure on their part will definitely, I think, have an impact on what happens in the Madigan case and decisions they end up making in evidentiary decisions and whether they put certain people on the stand or don't put people on the stand. But the U.S. Attorney's Office here has a very, very high track record of victory. And the tapes are really going to be, I think, the most important evidence because they are his own words laying out as alleged by the government, a conspiracy to shake down people for his own private gain.
And getting someone to record those tapes, what do you think it took to get Danny Solis to wear a wire for what, almost 2 years?
I think it was longer than that.
I mean, what do the feds do to convince someone to do that?
Well, I think a couple things happen. One is you got to be in trouble yourself. It rarely happens, and certainly not for that long. That's a long time to be deceiving your family, your wife, your kids, your colleagues, to be on the city council chamber, to be in meetings, wearing a wire and having no one know about it except for you, the time it takes to secretly meet with your handlers, to give over those tapes, to talk about other potential targets. That's almost a full-time job in and of itself. And I feel sorry for his constituents because they clearly didn't have the benefit of a fully functioning alderman during that time. And it's unprecedented that someone would wear a wire that long and only stop because of an error that an affidavit, search warrant affidavit, got disclosed. Look, he clearly felt like he was in a vice grip. But you have to also wonder whether or not there was a part of Danny Solis that felt like the gig is up. It's time for me to come clean. He clearly got an amazing deal. The fact that he won't do any jail time, the fact that he will get to keep his taxpayer-funded pension. Now, I've been very vocal in thinking that that's an abomination. But it'll be interesting to see then what happens to him, whether he becomes the empty chair at the trial, whether or not he is somebody who's called later on down the line.
Predictions. The feds don't lose often.
They do not. Look, I don't want to sit here and judge it. I don't know all the evidence inside and out. I think it's going to be a big fight. I think it'll be an interesting fight because of the talents of the lawyers on both sides and the talent of the judge. But those tapes are going to be really, really difficult to overcome.
You must have had some vision of what it would be like. Was it as you expected? What was reality like?
Well, I had seen Ed Burke operate from a distance before. I understood quite clearly who he was and what kind of person he was. It's no secret now that he tried to use his power to get me years ago to dangle a judgeship in front of me. Luckily, that's not something I've ever aspired to. But Ed Burke is not the kind of guy you want to owe a debt to. So I had a sense of who he was and how he operated. I worked for city government for a number of years before I even thought about running. So I had some sense of him. I was, we'll say, surprised at that very first city council meeting that he tried something. But I think he, as a more veteran alderwoman said, and I won't give names, but you can figure out who it is. I guess he must have forgotten that you were a lawyer too. So, but I was always on the watch for him because I knew that having rejected his overtures to be part of the group of debtors to Ed Burke, that he wasn't going to go away quietly.
There are stories of how he would reach out to people with handwritten letters of, if you lost an election or whatever, and say, oh, thinking of you, that was a tough one. Or, I mean, he was sort of this schmoozy guy that would get people to be friends.
Mm-hmm. Look, I think part of his methods was to disarm people with his charm, with his seeming generosity. But that's like a spider trying to lure the fly into the net. Once you got into bed with that guy, there's no getting out. And I saw other people make that mistake. I wasn't going to make that mistake with him.
We've seen,
and I wasn't going to do what other mayors had done, which is to cut a deal where he got to keep his power. It helped, of course, that the indictment came down, but there was no possibility that I was going to allow that guy to continue his power.
He still had the retired cops with Rom. I mean, he still had the driver and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Daley didn't really get along, but the same deal. They had a deal.
Yeah, they had détente. There was not going to be any détente with me. This was a guy who, despite his efforts to try to remake himself, fundamentally was a racist. Fundamentally was homophobic. I don't think had a lot of regard for women in power. He and I were never going to get along. But also he was just fundamentally the antithesis of what I thought good government should be about. And to keep him in any position of power The press and residents would have rightfully said that I was a hypocrite. There was no way that we could coexist in the same way.
What do you think his indictment, how has it, do you think the council's in better shape with spreading the power around more than having this strong finance chair?
I think that the jury is out with this particular council. You know, harken back to my last city council meeting and the lavish praise that was heaped upon him by a number of people. Some of those people are still around. It was tough to listen to from where I sat and knowing the history. But, you know, the challenges of good governance and ethics didn't just disappear with an election. And I hope for some of the new people that they put their responsibilities to the residents above their own personal ego and agenda. But I think the jury is out.
He's got to be nervous this weekend, heading into this trial.
You know, look, I know how I felt as a lawyer, both as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney, when a big trial was coming, what was at stake. And it wasn't my life on the line. And I'm sure somewhere he's going for consolation because he's got to be nervous. This is the rest of his life and how he's going to spend it really at stake. That's what's at stake when that jury is convened and sworn in and the first witnesses are called. It's his life and the rest of his life and how he's going to spend it, whether he's going to be there and available for his family or not. Certainly it's also about his legacy. It's also the broader question of the legacy of the machine politics and power in Chicago. It's an interesting moment in our collective history, and the jury will be the judge.